Thank you for being here. Rabbi Doug Fischer of Young Israel of Orange County. Thank you for being here. If you're watching us online on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and please give us a like, and please send the link to someone else who might be interested also. So here we go. We've been learning, and we're expanding beyond what we've been learning on this subject of not being allowed to go to Egypt. How do we blend that with the reality that Jews do go into Egypt? So here we start. Rambam had said in Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Malachim, Milchamot, the laws of war and kings, Mutar Lishkom B'chol Ha'olam Chutz Me'eretz Yisrael. Now Rambam is writing in the 1100s that you're allowed to, so this is not just biblical times or Talmud times, but a full 1,000 years later, and 1,000 years before us, that it's permitted for Jew to live anywhere in the world except Egypt. Min Hayam HaGadol va'ad ha'ma'arav, and he says from the Mediterranean Sea as far as you can imagine, anywhere except for Egypt. Keneged Kush, Keneged Amidbar, going all the way out to Ethiopia. Hakol Asur Lihyashev Ba, but as far as Egypt itself, you're not allowed to reside there, make it a permanent place. And he cites the three Pesukim, the three biblical verses that we learned via Alexandria, Bechlal HaIsur, and Alexandria, where we learned a few weeks ago there was an amazingly strong, vibrant, and numerically large Jewish community. Even that was forbidden. And we've noted inter alia that Rambam himself lived in Egypt. The Rambam had started off in Spain. Spain went under Catholic rule. In those days, 1,000 years ago, we were on adequately good terms with the Muslims, and the Catholics were the problem, with their inquisitions that came later and other persecutions, and Jews had to flee when the Muslim countries went Catholic. And Rambam, as did so many others from his neck of the woods, ended up in Mitzrayim. And so on the one hand, he was teaching, you're not allowed to live in Egypt. And on the other hand, he's in Egypt. And we learned also, Mutar L'chzor L'Eretz Mitzrayim L'Schora V'Lepragmatia, that although you're not allowed to establish a permanent residence in Egypt, you would be allowed to be in Egypt for a while to do business or to engage in any kind of commerce. So it's not that you're not allowed to set foot in Egypt, but you're not allowed to make a life there. And again, we would think, well, that was 1,000 years earlier, the time of the Bible, and Pharaoh, and the 10 plagues. That's 1,000 years later. But Rambam's telling us 1,000 years later that the Torah verses that we've learned the last few weeks continued to be in effect. And again, it's counterintuitive because we know that over the years, Jews have ended up in Arab countries. That's where the Sephardim came from, primarily. They started in Spain, Sfarad, and then they worked their way into Northern Africa, the Arab countries. And then in the 1940s and 50s, as the state of Israel emerged, the Arab countries started expelling their Jews, which, by the way, is interesting because the Arabs go around saying that they're entitled to reparations on grounds that they were driven out of, let's say, Israel territory in 1948 during the War of Independence. And so they say, we want the right to return and we want to get reparations. And they claim that 600,000 or 500,000 were expelled. And we've learned about that in the past. And maybe in a year or so, we may even go back on Sundays to relearning the history of the rise of the state of Israel and all of that. At the same time that the Arabs were moving on their own, they weren't being expelled, they of their own volition were leaving. At that same time, Arab countries were expelling 750,000 Jews. And unlike Arabs, who voluntarily had left as Israel came into being and took whatever they could with them if they wanted, Jews were expelled and were not allowed to take anything with them. So Iraq and Yemen and Morocco and all those Arab countries, Libya, Egypt, they seized all the property of the Jews. And the Jews were financially somewhat successful. And they seized all Jewish property and kicked out 750,000 Jews, who today comprise half the population of Israel. They ironically built and saved the state of Israel during her early going. Who knows if she would have had half the population she ended up having at the beginning. Israel basically was populated by almost a million Jews kicked out by Arabs and Holocaust survivors. Amazing how that happened. Otherwise, who knows how many Jews there would have been to stand up to the Arabs during the independence wars. Okay, let's continue. So you're allowed, Rambam says, to go there for business. We've learned that in the past. Obviously, we're moving beyond that. Just quickly, for the benefit of those catching us on YouTube who don't have the background, or for those of us just refreshing, the ein asur el l'shtakeh sham. You're not allowed except to make a permanent residence there. The ein lo kin alav said, we also learn that you don't get a punishment by the Beit Din, by the courts, the Jewish courts that enforce Jewish law. You do not get punished if you do go there intending to live, because we don't punish based on intentions. It is in God also. A Jew is not punished by God or by the court based on wrongful intentions. If a person takes a gun with the intention to go and murder someone, but he ends up having a car accident on the way, and he ends up not doing the murder, and that he doesn't get there, or the guy whom he intended to murder didn't show up, he is not punished in Jewish law nor in the court of heaven for having intended to do a grave and evil sin if he didn't do it. All the more so a person who moves to Egypt intending to live there permanently, well, he has not committed a punishable sin until he does it. And that can't happen unless he's still there the day he dies, right? If you move to Egypt with the intent of living there permanently, buys or rents a home or whatever, and gets a job and enrolls his kids in an Egyptian yeshiva, and all with the intention never to leave, he still has not committed the sin of being there permanently until he was there permanently. If he's there 40 years and then the day before he dies, he leaves, so it turned out he wasn't there permanently. The only moment it truly can be said that he violated the law and was there permanently is if he died there. So on the day he died, we look back and say, looks like he came permanently. So he couldn't be punished for that, because by then he's dead. So Rambam says there's no punishment for, you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to go there intentionally to live there permanently, but there's no punishment for it. Shebe'et aknisa mutarhu, because when he entered, he hasn't committed the sin of going permanently, and he is allowed to go there for purposes of business or commerce. Ve'im yachshov le'shev l'shtakeh sham. If it was in his mind to go to stay there permanently, ein bo maseh. Still, he hasn't done it, as I just explained. V'yera eli she'im kavash eretz Mitzrayim melech Yisrael al pi bet din shemuteret. And it appears to me, Rambam says, it seems to me, that if a king of Israel, with the approval of the Jewish court, gets permission to go to war and take land in Egypt, that would be allowed. Below his hira el shuv lach yechidim olishkon ba. That is, the Torah did not prohibit except individuals moving there to live there permanently, but not necessarily the Israeli military under the leadership of the king to go in, to go in and take land. Anyway, that's basically what we've studied. Now we're going forward. And for this, I have to give you background, because we're going to learn it, but let's have the background first. And to have the background, let's look at the map. Assyria. So we're going to talk a little bit about Assyria. First of all, the word, the name. Do not mix up Assyria with Syria. They sound the same, but they are incredibly different, both in terms of history and present times in terms of the Jewish interface. It's so very, very easy because Assyria does not exist today. So since Assyria does not exist today, it's extremely easy to think in terms of, well, I guess he said Assyria, he means this. No, two different. It's like in Africa, there's Nigeria, and there's another country whose name on paper seems the same, Niger. They pronounce it most appropriately, not Niger, but Niger, Niger. And of course, not the way one might mistakenly think it's spelled. It's pronounced. So there's Niger and Nigeria. Niger and Nigeria, two different, or like Iraq and Iran. IRA and one more letter, Q or N. But they're two very different countries. Or one more example, Paraguay and Uruguay. So the fact that we're talking about Assyria, and I really want to emphasize, in Hebrew it's easy, Assyria is Ashur, and Syria is Surya, Ashur, Surya. Let's get back to this now. Assyria is irrelevant now, but in its time, it is maybe one of the most consequential of all countries we unfortunately had to deal with. So let's see the Assyrian Empire. It was an empire. We often talk about God's incredible miracle of how the Jewish people, 3,300 years later, still exist as same people, same religion, same heritage, same culture, same land, and so many other nations that were so much larger and more powerful all are gone. So what happened at the time, biblical time, this is Eretz Israel, that small little country. Jerusalem, Samaria is so small. Yehudah, Judea, Shomron, that's it. And on the right, the other side of the Jordan River, Ammon, Moab, Edom, we've come to see those many times in our Tuesday night class, King David. Ammon, Moab, Edom. And this is what now is known as Syria, Damascus, but in biblical times was known as Aram. And those were the four main countries we had to deal with as Jews in those days, plus Egypt. Aram, Ammon, Moab, Edom, Egypt. And there are various laws in the Torah we've learned on Tuesday nights, particularly, but also Thursday nights, that we were not allowed to marry into certain of these nations, and that we were not allowed to accept them as converts. Very famously, for example, Moab. We were permitted to accept women Moabites, like Ruth HaMoaviyah, whose book we read on Shavuot. But you're not allowed to accept male Moabites. And we've learned about this. Here's Assyria. It was the empire. This entire zone, Assyria ended up conquering Israel, or certainly the northern part, and all this was their empire. Extraordinary. Nineveh. I mean, and these were the days of Media, as Persia. One empire after another swallowed up the next one. Assyria would get swallowed up by Babylonia, which initially was, I guess, subservient to Syria. And Assyria, and then Babylonia became an empire. And before them, there was Media and Persia. Okay. So it's important to have this picture now. Another look. What was called by the British or the Romans Palestine, Eretz Israel, Yerushalayim. Tyre is part of Lebanon. In biblical times, it wasn't called Lebanon, but it was called Phoenicia. In biblical times, Philistines. What we now know as Syria, Assyria, Ashur, Babylonia, Egypt. And one more look. The Assyrian Empire. Gigantic. And in white, this map shows you what they are today. There was no Iraq in those days. Iran is like in the 1950s, it was renamed Iran. It always had been known as Persia and was renamed Persia after the Shah was kicked out or after the Shah departed. So Assyria, that empire, included Israel, the country of Jordan, the country of Syria, Iraq. I mean, look what we're talking about. Okay. Why am I going through all this? So you understand, it's to the east of Israel, not literally on the east, but there's Syria in between. And let's see why I'm doing this. Okay. Malachim Bet, 2 Kings, chapter 17. By now, the Jewish nation had split in half. In fact, one half of that split is coming to an end now. As we've learned both Tuesday nights and Thursday nights, there came a point after the death of King Solomon when under his son Rehoboam, there was a civil war, a bloodless civil war, and the north split from the south. And for the rest of time, the Jewish people were divided into two separate countries, sometimes allied and sometimes actually militarily opposed and went to war against each other. And the Northern Kingdom was 10 tribes, and they were known as the Kingdom of Israel, or the Kingdom of the North, or the Kingdom of Shomron. And the Southern Kingdom was known as the Kingdom, if the North was known as Israel, the Southern 3 tribes were known as Judea, or the Kingdom of Yehudah, or the Southern Kingdom. Judea, Samaria, Yehudah, Shomron, or Israel. Now there were 10 tribes up north and 3 tribes down south. How did the Jews end up with 13 tribes? Because from Joseph, one of the 12 brothers, there did develop 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. That's a whole other story we've talked about in the past, we'll talk about in the future, but not right now. Now, by now we're at 2 Kings. In other words, on Tuesday night we're in 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet. And that covers the time of King David. 1 Kings, Melachim Aleph, covers the years of Shlomo, and then eventually it moves into the Civil War. And 2 Kings covers the countries of Israel, Northern Kingdom, and Judah, Southern Kingdom, through their entire period of existence. And as they come to an end, the 2 kingdoms, and we become conquered by Babylonia, those 2 books of Melachim, Kings, come to an end. So, in 2 Kings 17, so it's starting to wind down, the text focuses in this chapter on what's going on with the Northern Kingdom. And that's actually how Melachim Bet works, 2 Kings. There'll be a chapter or 2 about the Northern Kingdom, then there's a chapter or 2 about the Southern Kingdom, sort of keeping it in the same sort of time zone. While this was going on in the north, now this was going on in the south. While this was going on in the south, this is what next was going on in the north, and so on and so forth. It's not like at first did 15 chapters on the north, and now that we're done with the history of the north, let's do the history, rather kept them parallel. And it normally begins by telling you something like this. Bishnat Shtei Yisrael Achaz Melech Yehudah. We were just telling you in chapter 16 about the king of Judah, Judea in the south, King Ahaz. Well, in the 12th year of the reign of Ahaz, we're now shifting over to the north. Malach Hoshea ben Elah b'Shomron. King Hosea was the king at the same time in the Northern Kingdom, Samaria. Al Yisrael, the kingdom of Samaria, also known as the kingdom of Israel. And he was king for 9 years. And he was an evil king, and God said, that's it, end of this kingdom. Too many evil kings, too much evil, too much violation of my Torah and my covenant with you, and it's over. Your country comes to an end in chapter 17. Not just a defeat in the military, this is the end. Vayasar Rabbi Hashem rak lo k'malchei Yisrael asher hayu lefanav. He did evil, and it wasn't as bad as the evil of the kings who preceded him, but it was the last straw. Allah alav Shalmaneser melech Ashur, and there arose to make war against the northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, Ve'lo Hoshea Eved, and he defeated Hoshea. Let's take that one. So he comes from Assyria, goes past Syria, from Ashur, goes past Phoenicia, Lebanon, and he's been conquering all of this. It's all part of his empire. And he goes into Israel, and he doesn't yet conquer the south. He first attacks the north, and he conquers Samaria, but he makes Samaria the country of Israel, again, not to be including Judea. He makes them his vassal, as if, that is to say, Israel retained her separate sovereignty, so to speak, as a vassal of Assyria. He made Hoshea his servant, his vassal. There you go, vassal, good translation. And the deal was, every year, you, Hosea, will reaffirm your loyalty and subsidiary status to Shalmaneser and Assyria by paying tribute, a monetary tribute. And that tribute will affirm whatever it is. By your paying this enormous sum, we will let you continue as a nominal king with power within the, like the power of a mayor of a city does not outrank the president. Even a governor does not outrank the president, but has a lot of power. So you'll still have your power, but not in any way subservient, not in any way on a level compared to us as your empire. Okay. Vayimtsa melech Ashur b'Hoshea kesher. After a few years of Hoshea paying his annual tribute, the king of Assyria saw that Hoshea was now plotting. He was plotting to pull away and fight for independence from Assyria and reestablish the independent sovereignty of the country of Israel. It was learned, the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, found out that Hosea, king of Israel, was secretly meeting, well, obviously not secretly enough, was secretly meeting with the king of Egypt with an effort to maybe break away. Because after all, let's remind ourselves, the Assyrian Empire included not only Israel, but also part of Egypt. So it was a plot that we are within his empire, we are the farthest away. While Syria is next door, and so is Babylonia next door to Assyria, and then there's Phoenicia. We are on the tail end, we probably look like a tail on his empire. Maybe the two of us can sort of break loose from the rest of his empire. So Hosea started to meet with the king of Egypt, and Shalmaneser found out about it. And suddenly, for the first time, Hosea did not send a tribute as he did every other year. Shalmaneser wasn't going to put up with that. And that's it. He went, he grabbed the guy and he put him in prison. No negotiations, no what's going on here. You don't show up with your tribute by the deadline, God knows what they'll do to you. He takes him and he throws him in a dungeon. That's the king, and that's the end. And the king of Assyria, after throwing the king of Israel into a dungeon in Assyria, goes and determines to destroy the entire country of Israel. Vayal Shomron, he goes up to Samaria, Vayatzar alha shaloshanim, and he lays siege for 3 years. Now, what does it mean to lay siege? When they lay siege, that means you can't get in, you can't get out. No food, no water, no nothing. Not like the war Israel's been fighting for a year in Hamas, Gaza, where they fill Gaza with food and water and medicine, all these so-called humanitarian supplies that don't even get to the people. Rather, Hamas is there waiting for the trucks, where they take the trucks, they commandeer the trucks, they take all the food, medicine, and water, and then what they are able to seize beyond what they can eat and drink, they use to recruit new people. Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are your parents and siblings hungry and thirsty? We will provide you with whatever you need, courtesy of Israel, if you join Hamas to destroy Israel. And that's the insanity that we've been living last year. In a real siege, you don't just go to war on one side and feed them with food and water and medicine on the other side. You cut them off. And that's how they fought in the Bible. That's how they fought in the United States also. In the 1800s, during the Civil War, Robert E. Lee got besieged by Ulysses S. Grant in Petersburg, then in Richmond, and they had to give up. They were starving to death. They gave up in 1863 in Vicksburg, Mississippi. They were starving to death. That was Grant's great strategy, to starve them to death. He didn't beat them frontally. He would fight wars, but his big thing was, once he got positioned through a war to create a siege, he would lay siege for a year or two or three till all the local food supplies would run out, and then he'd start dropping like flies, and then he'd give up. So that's what happened to the Jews under Shalmaneser, and later on, of course, that's what's going to happen under Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, will lay siege, and that's going to start on the 10th of Tevet, and they're going to be so hungry by the 17th of Tammuz that Nebuchadnezzar is going to break the walls, and it's going to lead to Tisha B'Av at the Beit HaMikdash. But we're not up to that yet. We're quite a while away from that. Here's the first fall of the kingdom of Israel. So Shalmaneser takes Hosea prisoner, determines there's been a secret conspiracy. He doesn't get his annual tribute payment, and therefore, Vayatzreu Melech Ashur, Vayatzreu Beit Kela, after locking up King Hosea, Vayatzar Aleha, Shalosh Shanim, he lays siege to the country of Israel, Samaria, for 3 years. They've got no more food. Bishnat Atashiyit LaHoshea, it's now the 9th year of King Hosea. How did the chapter begin? It said at the beginning of the chapter that, parallel to what we were just learning in chapter 16 about King Ahaz, down south in Judea, Hosea was the king in Samaria, Shomron, for 9 years. So this is the 9th year. It's all coming to an end here. So there it is, Bishnat Atashiyit LaHoshea, and in the 9th year of King Hosea, Loachad Melech Ashur Shomron, the king of Assyria, thoroughly captured, didn't simply subdue them, but brought them to an end. He captured Samaria, basically took Samaria as a country off the map. Vayagel et Yisrael Ashura. Vayagel, from the word Golah, Galut, Galus, Galut. And he exiled at Yisrael. He exiled the people of Israel, again, not including those living in the Southern Kingdom. Ashura, that's a Hebrew construction, a biblical Hebrew construction and poetic, though not used in everyday street language, is you take the name of a place and you add komatse, ha'ah, and that means to, to that place. If you go habaita, that's el habayit. If you go habaita, it's to your house. If you're going Yerushalma, that's to Yerushalayim. Ashura, El Ashur, to Assyria. So, and I emphasize the A, I pronounce it with a short A like Assyria, though in everyday life it really would be called Assyria. But I want to avoid that Aleppo misunderstanding, especially because there's a Syria as well as Assyria. So he takes Shomron, Israel, off the map. He exiles all Jews of Israel to his empire. Vayeshev Vayoshev otam b'chlat v'chavor, nahar goes on v'arei madai. He basically exiles the 10 tribes throughout his empire to a place called Halah and a place called the river of, let's say, Chavor, and the one of Gozan, and the towns of Medea. That's a little bit of a distance, isn't it? Was it on this map? Let's find Medea. There we go. So he's taking Jews in exile, and he's taking them, not only marching them past Aram, Syria, and Phoenicia, Lebanon, not only to Assyria, he's marching some to Medea. In other words, what he did was he broke up the 10 tribes in such a way that he would destroy the unity of the people and the identity of the people. He spread them throughout such a massive empire that extended from all these different countries to Babylonia, to Assyria, to everywhere. I mean, we're talking about, again, we're talking about taking them through what we now know as Syria, all the way up, some up to Turkey, some to Iraq, some to the border of Iran, some to just about the border of Saudi Arabia, some to, he took it, and he just broke us up. That's why we're lost. The reason that I'm a Jew and you're a Jew and we know is that when Babylonia will exile Judea, the southern kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar will exile all 3 remaining tribes together: Judah, Yehudah, Benjamin, Binyamin, and Levi. So he's going to bring us all to one place, Babylonia, and he's going to keep all of us together, and we're going to all be under the leadership of people like Daniel, and Michal, and Azariah, and later Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel. So we're going to have a continued national identity for the 3 tribes that go south, and that's why we're there. And by the way, that's why we're called Jews. Because of the 3 tribes, Yehudah, Judah, was primarily the most populous. So when you meet a person like me or you today, the odds are we're not Benjaminites. We're probably not Benjamin. That's less than 10%. And if you're a Levi, you're a Levi, or a Kohen, that's known. But the odds are 9 to 1 that you're from Yehudah. So therefore, we're called Yehudim. Hebrew, it's Yehudi, Yehudim. English, it's Jew. That's where that term comes from. But north, the 10 tribes were completely broken up and disappeared. Excuse me for an occasional sound, my cough. So we become the 10 lost tribes. There is a theory, take it or leave it, that one of the 10 lost tribes, the tribe of Dan, not to be confused with the person Daniel, rather Dan, that the tribe of Dan ended up in Ethiopia, down here. And so the modern Ethiopian Jews who were rescued in Israel in 1985, 1987, 25,000 Jews out of Ethiopia brought to Israel. It is believed by many that that was the tribe of Dan. The other tribes are absolutely lost. No one's got a clue where they are. People play around with different theories. Maybe there's a group in India, and maybe this group and that group. But basically, they're the lost tribes, lost 10 tribes, and that's what it says later in the Tanakh, that in Mashiach times, Messianic times, the ones who were lost to the Assyrians will come back to Jerusalem, but till then they're gone. How much larger a people would we be today if they weren't gone? And what would have happened during the Holocaust with Hitler if 10 of the 13 tribes still were there? Would we have been bigger? Would we have been massacred worse? So many questions. What if 10/13 of us had not been taken away? That's 5, 6, it's about 80%. 80% of the Jews are missing. And that's also why you hear people talk about, like Moranos from Spain have a tradition that we originally have a tradition that maybe we came from a Jewish tribe, one of the tribes that was exiled by Assyria. We continue. So Assyria drove us out, and it was their strategy to prevent us from ever coming back. And it worked. We lost We lost our identity, even worse than Bernie Sanders and George Soros. I mean, George Soros and Bernie Sanders, that's Ben and Jerry, Chuck Schumer, those are apostates. These are definitely Jews. Some people like to say political, oh, he's not a Jew. Bernie Soros, he's not a Jew, or Bernie Sanders, not a Jew. And they are Jews. You can't just say a guy's not a Jew. He's an apostate Jew, but he's a Jew. But most of these people are completely lost. Vayiki chatu b'nei Yisrael Hashem, Elokehem, and then Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, who's the author of the Book of Kings, both books of Kings, goes into a sort of soliloquy explaining why all this happened, because the Jews sinned, and we're going to skip that because that's not pertinent. It's very interesting. One of these days we'll get to it, God willing, but it's not pertinent to tonight's class, and so on and so forth. And so Hashem spurned all the offspring of Israel and afflicted them and delivered them into the hands of plunderers, and finally cast them out from the divine presence. In other words, Hashlicha mipanav, that we don't, he knows where we are, but basically we've disappeared. Those 10 disappeared, just disappeared. And so the second part of this is this part, and then you'll see why I'm getting into all of this in the midst of the Egypt part of our class. In the end, God removed Israel not referring to the Jewish people, but the Northern Kingdom, from the divine presence, as they had been warned through all God's servants, the prophets. So the Israelites, again referring to the 10 tribes of Northern Kingdom of Samaria, were deported from the land to Assyria. Vayigal Yisrael me'alat mato Ashura, they were sent into Galut, into Syria. Let's get Olga in, the second Olga, or the first, depending on how you count the oldest. And they were deported to Assyria, as is still the case. Yirmiyah writing Malachim Bet, 2 Kings, says Ad Hayom Hazeh. Now when he says until this day, that's like 3,000 years ago. And since then, there have been developments in life. But interestingly, those 3 words still apply. Ad Hayom Hazeh. To this day. They're gone. They are gone. There's a whole interesting, let's just take a side on this. The whole interesting thing with when the Ethiopian Jews came back to Israel in 1985, great debate. Are they Jewish? Aren't they Jewish? Are they Jews, maybe from the tribe of Dan, who got lost and we found them? Are they non-Jews who took on Jewish practices, like the Khazars in Eastern Europe, or Khazars, I think, or there are certain peoples who took on certain Jewish practices, but they're not Jewish. Noahites. It's an interesting thing. A lot of debates about the Ethiopian Jews. When they came, are we allowed to marry them? Well, if they're Jews, we are. And if they're not Jews, we're not. Can we count their men in a minyan? Well, if they're Jews, they can. And if they're not Jewish, they can't. What do you do with them? We don't know whether they're the tribe of Dan. If they are the tribe of Dan, start getting count the minyan right away. You can marry them tonight. If they're not the tribe of Dan, what do you do? So the chief rabbinate of Israel decreed that we need for all the Ethiopians to go into a mikveh and go through. They don't have to study for 2 years. They don't have to go through all this stuff that a typical prospective convert would. You have to study, and you have to come under the direction and mentorship of a local rabbi and a beit din. You have to show you keeping Shabbos, and you have to go into a mikveh. The ruling was, on the Ethiopian Jews, they don't have to go basically any kind of process, but they must go into a mikveh. And I believe they don't say the bracha, because there's a halakhically called safek brachot lahakel. When there's a question whether you should recite a bracha and we're not sure, the law is don't recite the bracha, because you're not allowed to take God's name in vain. Let's say you're about to drink a glass of water, cup of water. Baruch Hashem Olam, shahakol niyeh b'dvaro. And for some reason, I don't know, did I just say the bracha or did I start the bracha? So you can't recite the bracha now because you're not sure whether you just recited it. So, or you wash your hands before hamotzi. Then you go back to the table. And then you ask your wife, where's the salt? Which actually would not require another bracha, but you don't know the halacha. You don't know the law. So you're not sure. I just asked, where's the salt? Do I have to wash my hands again and say the bracha again? Or do we say that asking for the salt is part of the act of eating the bread? The halacha is the latter. Having asked for salt, you haven't interrupted. But if you had done an interruption after washing your hands, you'd have to wash again and say the bracha again. So you're not sure. So the halacha is you don't say the bracha again. Safek brachot lahakil. If you're not sure whether you need to recite a bracha or which bracha, then you don't recite the bracha. Except something to do with shahakal. I don't want to get into that now. So the Ethiopians came. Did they need to be converted? Well, not exactly, but they should go into a mikveh with the intention, if they needed to go to a mikveh for conversion, you're in the mikveh. And if you didn't need to go in the mikveh, so you got wet and you'll dry up. And should you say a bracha? Well, if you didn't need to go, then you don't say the bracha, so you don't say the bracha. So that, by the way, is what ended up happening with Ethiopia. And on the subject of Israel being a racist country, right? Apartheid, racist country. What other country in history, what other white country sent their army to risk their lives to bring in 25,000 black people? United States? Yeah, we risked our lives so we could have slaves. Right, we brought in black people. What country in history, white people, ever brought black people, and a lot, not just a boatload, 25,000 blacks to be full equal citizens? Racist country that's so evil in the world. So anyway, the tribes got lost. One more thing about Ethiopians while we're on it. Very interesting. So they're trying to figure out what's the deal on the Ethiopians. So when they were discovered, I mean, they were there already. What do you mean discovered? It's like the way the Native Americans, the Indians, are offended when people say that Columbus discovered America. And they say, hey, we were here. I mean, the fact that you guys didn't know we were here. It's not like Columbus took a wrong turn, showed up, and suddenly we exist. We were here long before this Italian. So in the same way, the Ethiopian Jews are there. And a Jewish guy, was sort of like a Marco Polo, exploring. It was like de Tocqueville. He was just going around, traveling the world, looking, and he found this Jewish community in Ethiopia. And he reported, here's what I found. Strangest thing. I found a bunch of black Africans. I don't mean just a bunch, thousands and thousands and thousands. And they have synagogues, and they're strictly kosher, and they keep Shabbat, and they pray in Hebrew, but they don't have Hanukkah. They have Purim, but they don't have Hanukkah. The craziest thing I ever saw. And they do this, and they do this, and they do this, but they don't do Hanukkah. And he began to realize these crazy Africans keep complete Torah law for any Jewish laws that existed in biblical times. And any Jewish thing that is post-biblical, they don't keep. They never even heard of. They never heard of Hanukkah. And that's part of how it was determined they might very well be the tribe of Dan, because they were thrown out of the Jewish people and exiled into Assyria with the end of the Bible. And that's when they lost the connection. And Hanukkah is the Greeks and everything, which the 3 tribes that had been exiled to Babylonia came eventually to experience upon their return to Israel. But the tribe of Dan and the 10 tribes, they never experienced anything post-biblical. So that was part of it as well. Back to this. Really interesting stuff. I remember living through it and all the questions, and I could just go on and on about the Ethiopian Jews. I really had an experience, got to know them, and so whole thing. Anyway, So what did what did the Shalmaneser also do? Listen to this. After he completely cleared out Samaria, the territory of the kingdom of Israel, Northern Kingdom, of all Jews, 10 tribes, King of Assyria then brought people from all the countries within his kingdom. He then started to pull non-Jews from this place and Haran, that's where Aram came from, Nineveh, Ashur, Aram, Babylonia. He starts grabbing non-Jews. I'll take some of these and some of these and some of these. And he pulls them together. And he pulls them from Babylon and Kut, and from Kut is Ethiopia, and Ava, and this place and that place. And he settled them in the towns of Samaria that he had just cleared out of Jews in place of the Israelites. It would be as though, and we're not going to get into that now, imagine Trump successfully clears all the Arabs out of Gaza and immediately then arranges to repopulate them with some people from France and some people from Spain and some people from Nigeria and some people from Russia and some people from here and there and there. And he fills up Gaza with people from 40 different countries, Arab, non-Arab, Christian, Hindu, whatever, so that there's a complete mix in the new Gaza so that the people have nothing to do with each other and they can't organize into a unity for like 100 years till they figure it out. And meantime, the ones that he drew out, imagine if instead of sending them all to Jordan and to Syria, he sends them all over there. Now, obviously, he doesn't have the power to do that. I don't even know whether he has power to clear out Gaza. But that's what the king of Ashur did. He took all the Jews out, split them everywhere, and then he took all the people from all over the place and he put them into Israel. And they took possession of Shimon. And so you see what he did. He, number one, destroyed the 10 tribes. He destroyed the country, and he prevented the country from reconstituting as a unified country that could be a headache for him, so that they would be complete vassals and part of his Assyrian Empire. That's what he did. When they first settled there, they did not worship God. Of course not. He brought them from all over the place. They didn't worship the God of Israel. This one worshipped, I don't know, this religion and that religion. So God sent lions against them. The land had been completely emptied, like the way Trump says he's going to do in Gaza. And I'm not going to get into that at all, but just to give you a contemporary image in your mind of what we're talking about. So the place is empty, but it's a holy place. It's not God. Well, Gaza is holy. It actually is part of Eretz Israel, and that'll resolve itself one day. But it's a holy land. It's not France. It's not Germany. It's a holy land. So miracles happen there. As Shalmaneser was populating it with people from all over, God sent lions to eat them up. They said to the king that this place is spooked. It's like a haunted house, only a whole country. The place is spooked. It's haunted. The nations that you deported and resettled in the towns of Shomron do not know the rules of the God of this place. We're worshiping our gods, minding our own business. This place is spooked. There's some God, because they're all polytheists, so they all believe the world has many gods. That's what made us so unique with monotheism. And it appears that this particular land has a unique God, and we don't worship him, and he's throwing us out. So therefore, that God's letting lions loose against us, and he's killing us, because we don't know the rules of that God. We don't know. The king of Ashur gave an order. Yitzhak Melech Ashur, send there one of the Kohanim of the Jews. I just expelled 10 tribes of Israel. Dig up one bona fide priest, Kohen, from among them to go and teach all these people the laws of that God, of that land. Send one Kohen whom you've deported. Holicho shama echad me'akonim asher higalitem misham v'yelchu v'yeshvu sham v'yorem et mishpat Elokei Yisrael. Let him teach them the practices of the God of that land. So one of the Kohanim who had been expelled came, and he lived in Bethel. That's a very famous city in biblical times. Abraham started off in Bethel. Yaakov was in Bethel. Everybody was in Bethel. That's in Samaria. There's a rebuilt community. There's a Jewish community. They call it a settlement. The nations call it a settlement. We call it a community in a city, Jewish community in Samaria, liberated Samaria of today. So that guy came and settled in Bethel, and he taught them how to worship the God of Israel. And each nation continued to worship their own gods, continue to make its own gods, and to set them up in the cult places. But at the same time, they also started to worship the God of Israel. So they did both. Let's see what else you got. So he's listing all the different people, and it's listing each one of the different people. The ones from Babylon, they ended up settling in Sukkot, and the people from Ethiopia settled in Nargale, and the people of Hamat. So these are different towns and cities in Samaria, and the people from each of the parts of the Assyrian Empire, whom Shalmaneser sent, ended up setting up their little places. It's like, what can I compare it to? It's like when I don't know what it's like now in Brooklyn, but in the 1960s, they had Little Italy. All the Italians lived in Little Italy, and the Chinese lived in Chinatown, and the Irish lived in a place in Manhattan called Hell's Kitchen. That's what it's called. And the Jews ended up in Borough Park and Crown Heights, and so on and so forth. And blacks ended up in Harlem, and Hispanics ended up in Spanish Harlem. And that goes on elsewhere. You know, Polish ended up in Chicago, and Mexicans in Miami, and you know how it goes. So they all lived together in a place. And the idea was they each found their own Little Italy and Hell's Kitchen in Shomron. And at the same time, while they were worshiping their own God, they likewise did some fealty, you know, fealty, to the God of Israel, because they worshipped our God. At Hashem hayu yireim, v'et Elohehem hayu ovdim. They feared our God, and at the same time they worshipped their God, kemishpat hagoyim, according to how each of these nations worshipped anyway. And until this day, namely when Jeremiah was writing, to this day they follow their former practices. They don't worship our God properly, so they don't keep proper Shabbos, they don't keep proper kashrus, but they give some lip service because they don't want to get eaten by lions. So they don't follow the blood. Einam Yireim et Hashem. They don't exactly fear Hashem. Einam Yosim Kechukatam Mishpatam, V'cha Torah V'cha Mitzvah. They don't keep the Torah, they don't keep the mitzvahs. Et B'nei Asher Shem Sivat B'nei Yaakov, that were taught to the Jewish people. Nevertheless, they made a covenant with them, etc., etc., etc. Okay. And in that way, God stopped sending lions to eat them up. All right. Why did I teach you all this? Let's learn. We go to Rambam, Hilchot Yisurei Bia, the laws of forbidden male-female relations. And there are many, many chapters about it. And we're not going to go into that. But every so often, in the course of a set of halachot, related halachot arise. So in Jewish law, certain physical relations between men and women are forbidden, obviously. And within the greater laws of forbidden relations with men and women, it's also forbidden, let's say, for Jews to have relations with Moabites, for a Jewish woman to have a relationship with a Moabite man, and to have relationships with these other forbidden nations from the Torah. Because we're gathering the Yisurei Bia, men and women who cannot go to bed together. And we know from the Torah, certain nations are not allowed to have intercourse with Jews, and vice versa. So he's putting that in. So still, what does this have to do with Egypt? And I had mentioned last class, very interesting, as we're starting to wind down, we're now tying it all together. And then next week will be, God willing, the final class on this subject of the ban on going to Egypt. But anyway, let's tie it together in these last three tabs now. So Yisrael Shaba'al Akum Mishar Ha'umot Derech Ishut. So it is forbidden to have relations with a non-Jew. O Yisraelit Shaba'al Akum Derech Ishut. It's forbidden to have like marriage. For the purpose of getting married to a non, intermarriage is forbidden. That's a simple way to put it. Ha'eru lo ken min Torah. Under Torah law, when there's a Beit HaMikdash, or Holy Temple, and the whole country is being run according to Torah law, which obviously has not happened since the time the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed by the Romans 2,000 years ago. If a Jew would intermarry, male or female, they would get whips, lashes. Shneimar lo titchatein bam, bitcha lo titein livno, bito lo tikach livnecha. So Doug Emhoff would be getting whipped, and Bernie Sanders would be getting whipped, and even a lot of good Jews would be getting whipped. So you'll say, wow, that's a lot of whipping. What would be going on is if you had a Beit HaMikdash, you would have a different Jewish people. Oh, you will have the same DNA Jewish people, but you would have a different kind of Jewish people. If you had a Beit HaMikdash and all Jews were living in Eretz Israel and weren't divided among the nations, and there was respect for the Torah, and everybody kept Shabbos, and everybody kept Kashrut, you wouldn't have this. You did not have intermarriage in biblical times, maybe an outlier here and there. You did not have all these Doug Emhoffs and Bernie Sanderses and Chuck Schumer types and whatever. Echad Shiva Amamin ve'echad Kolimu B'Yisrael. And Rambam says, we're talking whether it's a Jew marrying one of the 7 forbidden nations that are spelled out in the Bible, Hittite, Yebusi, Girgashi, etc., the Amori, the Perizi, the Canaanite, or any nation. V'chein mafarash al yedei Ezra. And this is in the book of Ezra. Ezra the scribe, there are 2 volumes that are related. There's the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. But we won't go into that, it'll go too long for this point. But the bottom line was, when Ezra, when the Jews, Nehemiah and everything, when the Jews came back from the Babylonian exile to Eretz Israel, Nebuchadnezzar had exiled the 3 tribes, Yehudah, Benjamin, and Levi. We ended up 70 years, 70 in Babylonia. Now we were permitted to go back by Cyrus and later by Darius, Koresh, and Daryavish, rebuild the temple. When the Jews started going back, as I just said a moment ago, there was a whole new Jewish regimen. And under a Beit HaMikdash, Jews were not going to be married to non-Jews. That was going to end intermarriage. And it created a whole dilemma, because as the Jews started going back to Eretz Israel under let's say, Nehemiah, and they started rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, they're not going to be intermarried. What about the people that are intermarried in Babylonia? What do we do? And then they had a whole long discussion. What are we going to do with our non-Jewish wives? And it's a whole thing. So we're not going to go there because it'll be too long and too late. Maybe someday in 30 years we'll get to Nehemiah. But in the meantime, it underscores you were not allowed to have intermarriage. And you weren't allowed to marry Moabites, Edomites, Egyptians, all of them. V'lo asrat Torah elader chatnut. Okay, so we're going to stay out of that right now because that's going to take us way off topic. But let's get to this next part, and then we'll see what we're saying. Okay. Otherwise, just a second. And if I don't find it immediately here, I'll go to the next tab because we're winding out. Okay, doesn't matter. We'll get the same exact next tab. Okay. So what happened was, at the time, so we're not allowed to marry those people. So the question then arises, okay, Rambam 1100, 1,000 years ago, we're not allowed to marry those people. The Edomites, the Moabites, the et cetera. So what do we do today? Let's say we meet a man meets a woman meets a man today, and the guy presents as a Jew, or she presents as a Jew. How do we know whether that person's DNA, whether that person's originally a Jew? So the Shulchan Aruch discusses it. Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law. Remember, Rambam's about 1100. Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, is around 1500. It's 400 years later. Even HaEzer, the laws I've taught you that there are 4 parts to the Shulchan Aruch. There's Orach Chaim about everyday life, and Yoredea about the more esoteric laws like slaughtering animals, building mikvahs, and Choshen Mishpat, laws of civil law like business law, and Even HaEzer, laws of relationships with men and women. And in chapter 4 of Even HaEzer, Ha'idna nitbalbelu kol ha'umot. Because of what that maniac Shalmaneser of Assyria did. Nowadays, all the nations are all conflated and mixed up, and we don't know who's who, and they don't know who's who, and everybody's mixed up. Lefichach Ammoni u'Moavi v'Edomi shenitgairu mutarim lavo b'kahal miyad. Therefore, if a guy comes and says, I'm descended, I got it on 23andMe, that I'm descended from Ammoni or Moab or Edom, and I converted to Jew, it doesn't matter. Everybody's right away allowed to convert and allowed to marry into the Jewish people, because right now, nowadays, we just have to assume that the vast majority of nations of the world were not forbidden to marry into the Jews. The Torah says you're not allowed to marry the 7 nations, the Canaanites, the Perizi, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, etc., Jebusites. Torah says them. Torah says Ammoni, Moavi, Edomi. Torah doesn't say you can't marry Brazilians, Guatemalans, Nigerians, South Africans, Russians, Ukrainians, Australians. The vast majority of the world were not banned in that sense, that they can't convert to Judaism. So Rubo Kakula, we follow the principle that we follow the majority, because we cannot any longer identify. Anu tolin shehume rovumot shehein mutarim. We have to assume that anybody who shows up nowadays comes from the majority of nations that weren't prohibited from converting to Judaism. You're never allowed to intermarry with any of those nations. The issue is, are they even allowed to convert to Judaism so you then can marry them? And with all other nations, except for the specified few, they can intermarry. So if someone comes to me, after they can convert and then marry. So if someone comes to me today and says, I'd like to convert to Judaism, I don't have to start exploring whether they trace their lineage back to Ammon and Moab, etc. I may assume, we all may assume, that they all are eligible to convert to Judaism. And that's Laharambam Hu Hadin LaMitzri. And Rambam says that law applies also to the modern day Egyptian. We assume nowadays that every Egyptian in Egypt is not necessarily an Egyptian in the way the Bible meant it in the 3 verses, the 3 Pesukim that ban us from going to Egypt. It's not the same Egypt. It's not the same Egyptians. That's Rambam, based on what we've learned tonight. So how could Rambam have ended up in Egypt from Spain? Because on top of everything else, where we learned previously that he ruled that if your life is in danger and you're fleeing for your life, you're allowed to go there meantime. And if you're going for business, you're allowed to go there. On top, and there's other opinions that if the majority of Jews in the world are not living in Israel, but the majority of Jews are living in exile anyway, you're allowed to go there. Only if the majority of Jews live in Israel are you not allowed to go there. And then there's a 5th opinion that you're allowed to go there as long as you're not going on a direct route from Israel to Egypt. But if you're going any other route, because it says B'darach hazeh, you're not allowed to go on this road again. But if you go any other, so on top of all the other reasons that nowadays would be allowed to move to Egypt and live there, on top of all that, Rambam says, Surah Occam's razors, the simplest answer is that they're not Egyptians. They call themselves Egyptians. They're not Egyptians. Based on what we learned tonight about Shalmaneser and what Assyria did, they mixed everybody up. Who the heck knows who they are? Because Assyria, remember, Assyria extended into Egypt. So they dumped people there and they pulled people there. Who knows who's who? And therefore, and therefore everybody's mixed up with everybody else nowadays. We depend on the rationale that we follow the majority of nations, and the Rambam extends that rule to Egypt. On the other hand, the Rosh, another great rabbinic decisor, posek, halakhist, he ruled Mitzri be'Isr Omed. He ruled when it comes to Egypt, they did not mix, and they remain forbidden for all time, even now. And we close out with this one. The Ritva on Yoma 38a. Talmud Yoma, one of the tractates of the Talmud, Yoma deals with the laws of Yom Kippur. On folio 38A, Daf Lamed Chet Amud Aleph, the Ritva comments, he's a commentator, commenting on the Talmud. Normally, I teach you Talmud. I don't normally go and bring in commentators on the Talmud because of time factors, but this one is pertinent enough, we close with him. So he says, he's commenting on the Gemara we learned 3 classes ago. Remember we learned about the 1,200,000 Jews in Alexandria. They were in such a big, gigantic stadium when they would daven and the chazan would wave a kerchief to let them know when it's time to answer Amen. But eventually God unfortunately allowed Alexander the Great to destroy those people. And the Gemara asks, why were they destroyed? Because the Torah had said Jews were not allowed to go back and make a permanent presence in Egypt, including Alexandria. So Ritva comments, Perish the afagav dechtiv lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh. He says, even though the Torah explicitly says you're not allowed to go back on this road, kavar pershu b'sifri lagur sham iyatah chozer. Nevertheless, we have to remember the midrashic teaching is that you're not allowed to go there for permanent, but you are allowed to go for the purposes of conducting business. Ritva says, nevertheless, you got to ask a question. Nowadays, most of the Jews living in Egypt are not going there for business. They went to Egypt. They didn't already have a job. They went to Egypt, they wanted the weather, they heard that it's more wealthy. Chagona Rambam, God bless him, he moved to Egypt from Spain, not for business, but to save his life. And other of the greatest Torah sages of the eras have moved to Egypt. So what's that all about? So first of all, he cites what I just told you a moment ago. The idea that Assyria under King Shalmaneser began a process of so destroying and conflating and mixing up all the different countries and nations within his empire. Nobody can truly say, I am a descendant from the original empire people. Ve'elo ayarot acherot, and therefore those cities, it may be on the earth, the same geographical location, but that Alexandria is not the Alexandria of the Talmud. It's not the Rome of the Talmud. It's the land of that area. You still can find the Greek amphitheater. You still can find the Roman Empire. You still can find the Arch of Titus, but that's not what that was. Shenit Yashvu Acharikain. The Harav Eliezer Mimitz Tirates, Shalo Asar HaKatuv, Rabbi Eliezer from the city, I believe, of Metz, M-E-T-Z. I may be wrong, but I think it's referring to M-E-T-Z in Germany. He has the opinion that when the Torah says you're not allowed to live in Egypt, that's only laholech b'derech shemei Eretz Yisrael. That only forbids if you're traveling literally from Israel to Egypt. But if you're going from Russia or from Brooklyn, then it's okay. But the halakhically kara lo tosifun l'shuv b'derech hazeh, because the Torah pasuk said you're not allowed to go b'derech hazeh, this path. But Ritva says, you want my opinion? How so many Jews ended up in Egypt? Religious leadership? V'anachon yoter, my opinion, that the real correct reason on what all these extraordinary Torah scholars rely to justify living in Egypt, she'ein ha'isur hahu elas bizman she'Yisrael shruyin al admatam, that the ban on living in Egypt exists only when the majority of Jews in the world are living in Israel. Then you have a country, your country, and you're not allowed to go to Egypt. But if we're in exile, even though there are some Jews in Israel, you would be avol bizman hazeh. Nowadays, Middle Ages it was, God has put a decree on the Jewish people that we live in exile all over the world. Well, under that circumstance, all of exile outside of Israel is the same, whether we're talking about America or Russia or Egypt. Ve'ein isur ela shelo letzeit midat min ha'eretz l'chutz la'aretz. The only ban is on deliberately moving from the land of Israel to go to Egypt. So as we wrap it up and close out today, and we're going to have one last class on this next week, we come away with the bottom line. A Jew today, according to most opinions, is allowed to live in Egypt. Under any opinion, you can't be punished for going to Egypt. Even those who would say you're not allowed, because it only applies if you go permanently, and there's no way to know whether you went permanently until the last second of your life, at which point it's too late to punish anyway. The idea of not even being able to go altogether, if you're going for business, it would be allowed. If you're going to live there temporarily, it would be allowed. Most would say if you're going there from any place other than Israel proper, it would be allowed. If it's a time when the majority of Jews live outside of Israel anyway, it would be allowed. So by and large, it is allowed with one. Thanks very much for being here. Look forward to seeing you, God willing, next Thursday. Bye-bye.